Welcome back to the Ancestral Findings podcast. You've probably seen it if you've ever driven down a sleepy road in the American South, maybe through Georgia, Louisiana, or northern Florida. Long, ghostly strands of gray-green threads dangle from oak branches like forgotten tinsel after a storm. Spanish moss sways in the breeze with a rhythm all its own, creating a scene that's equal parts romantic and haunting. It's one of those things you notice, even if you don't know what it is. But what exactly is Spanish moss? Is it alive? Is it harmful to trees? Why is it called Spanish moss when it has nothing to do with Spain, and it certainly doesn't look like moss as we know it? As it turns out, this mysterious plant has a backstory as intriguing as its appearance. From colonial rivalry to folk tales, from mattresses to medicine, Spanish moss has been tangled into people's lives for centuries. Let's pull on one of those gray strands and see where the story takes us. The name Spanish moss is a classic case of mistaken identity and a little historical sass. When French explorers first encountered this stringy plant hanging from the trees, they weren't enchanted. To them, it resembled a tangled, scruffy beard, so naturally they named it Barbe Espagnole, Spanish beard, as a jab at their colonial rivals. They said, "This looks like something those unkempt Spaniards would wear on their chins." The Spanish weren't about to let that insult go unanswered. They responded by calling the plant cabello francés, French hair, probably imagining it as fussy and full of knots. But the French name is stuck in the end, even in English translations. And so, despite its botanical inaccuracy and lack of national allegiance, Spanish moss became the common name. Oddly enough, the plant has no roots in Spain and is not a moss. But like many things passed down through centuries of storytelling, the name took on a life of its own. Despite its name, Spanish moss isn't moss. It's a bromeliad, a pineapple relative. Though you won't find any tropical fruit growing from its wiry strands, it doesn't root in soil or climb like ivy. Instead, it clings loosely to trees, primarily southern live oaks and bald cypress, using their branches as a resting place rather than a food source. Here's the fascinating part. Spanish moss doesn't need soil because it gets everything from the air. It's an epiphyte, a plant that lives on other plants but isn't parasitic. Think of it as a respectful house guest rather than an intruder. It absorbs moisture and nutrients through tiny scales on its thread-like leaves, drawing from rain, fog, and even dust in the air. Its silvery green appearance comes from these scales, which also help it reflect sunlight and conserve water. This allows it to thrive in humid environments and explains why it's primarily found in the American South, where the air can feel like soup in the summer. Because Spanish moss doesn't harm the trees it grows on, it's usually left alone, unless it gets so dense that it blocks out light or weighs down branches. In most cases, it simply coexists, swaying quietly like a natural wind chime made of living thread. Before French explorers coined mocking names and settlers began stuffing it into chairs, Spanish moss was already used by Native American tribes who understood its practical value. To them, it wasn't just decoration dangling from the trees. It was a versatile natural resource woven into everyday life. Some tribes used Spanish moss as insulation, stuffing it into moccasins or placing it between the walls of huts to keep out the cold. Others twisted and braided it into ropes, fishing nets, or lightweight blankets. Its stringy, durable fibers could be dried and softened, then worked like thread, helpful in a world that valued every natural material. Medicinally, Spanish moss found a place in healing practices, too. It was sometimes steeped in water or boiled into teas to treat fevers or respiratory issues. The Seminole and other southeastern tribes occasionally used it in poultices, wrapping it around wounds or injuries with other herbs to soothe the skin. There's also evidence it was used in ceremonial clothing or decorations, adding texture and movement to items worn during dances or special occasions. Spanish moss, with its ghostly shimmer and delicate threads, had a certain beauty to it, and many tribes saw that both practically and symbolically. As European settlers arrived and began building lives in the American South, they quickly discovered that Spanish moss wasn't just something hanging from the trees. It was free, plentiful, and surprisingly practical. What the native tribes had been doing with moss for generations now found new hands and new purposes in colonial life. One of the most common uses? Furniture stuffing. Before synthetic foams and factory-made cushions, people needed something soft yet firm to fill mattresses, pillows, and chairs. Spanish moss, once dried and cleaned, made a perfect filler. It was springy, abundant, and didn't cost a dime. In fact, for much of the 18th and 19th centuries, it was the go-to stuffing material throughout the South, but it wasn't as simple as pulling it off a tree and throwing it into a mattress. Fresh Spanish moss is full of tiny bugs, red chiggers in particular, and it had to be properly processed. Settlers would spread it out in the sun to dry or soak it in water and then let it rot slightly before stripping away the outer layer to reveal the soft, black inner fibers. It wasn't a pleasant-smelling job, but the result was worth it. Clean, fluffy moss fiber ready for use. Beyond bedding, moss found its way into plaster walls as insulation and as a binder in construction. Farmers used it in livestock bedding. Some even used it to mulch gardens or tie bundles of herbs and tobacco. During the early 20th century, it entered the automotive world, where companies like Ford used it to stuff the seats of early Model T cars. People built entire cottage industries around harvesting and processing Spanish moss. In places like Louisiana and Florida, it wasn't unusual to see moss drying in massive piles outside someone's home. Yes, moss gins sprang up like cotton gins to process it more efficiently. For a time, Spanish moss was a small but thriving economy in certain parts of the South. Spanish moss may look like lazy strands just hanging around, but if you peek closely, it's buzzing with life, quite literally. It's not just a plant, it's an entire neighborhood. Because of its thick, tangled texture, Spanish moss provides an ideal shelter for various creatures. Birds, especially smaller species like warblers and finches, often use it to line their nests. It's soft, easy to gather, and blends beautifully with the natural surroundings, making it perfect camouflage. Some birds will build their entire nests inside dense clusters of moss, hidden from predators and shaded from the sun. But it's not just birds. Tree frogs, lizards, and tiny snakes have all been found nestled in its folds. Insects, too, lots of them. While that might make it less appealing to shake hands with, it plays an essential role in the ecosystem. Some insects feed on the moss, others use it for shelter, and a few even rely on it to complete their life cycle. Spiders set up webs, moths lay eggs, and beetles tunnel through it. Then there's the moss. Airborne, rootless, and surviving entirely off rainfall, mist, and floating dust. It doesn't draw from the tree it lives on, so it doesn't act as a parasite. Instead, it coexists peacefully, forming a mini-world within a larger one. In the swampy parts of the South, the image of moss-laden trees hanging over still water isn't just picturesque, it's a sign of a healthy, active ecosystem. Spanish moss may not seem flashy, but it's a cornerstone of the life that flourishes in those slow-moving southern landscapes. From ghost tales whispered on front porches to moody scenes in southern novels and films, this strange plant has become part of the South's cultural identity, often symbolizing mystery, romance, and even the supernatural. You'll find it in the backdrop of Gothic fiction, where old plantations are described with moss draping from crumbling oaks like the ghosts of the past. Writers like William Faulkner and Flannery O'Connor didn't always name it outright, but the imagery was there, moss-laden trees that watched over generations of secrets and sorrow. In movies, Spanish moss is practically shorthand for southern setting. Whether it's Forrest Gump sitting on a bench under it or eerie shots of moss-covered trees in horror films, it helps set a mood that's both beautiful and unsettling. It feels like time slows under its threads, like the air thickens with memory. And then there's the folklore, some rooted in truth, some in pure imagination. One well-loved legend tells of a Spanish soldier who fell in love with a Native American woman. Her father disapproved of the union, and the soldier was killed. According to the tale, his beard was hung from a tree as a warning, but over time the beard kept growing and growing, spreading from tree to tree, and becoming the Spanish moss we see today. The story changes from place to place, but the idea sticks. Spanish moss is a living memory of lost love. In some cultures, it's considered bad luck to bring Spanish moss indoors, especially freshly picked, not just because of the bugs, though that's reason enough, but because of the spirits it's said to carry. Some believe the moss whispers at night if brought inside, disturbed by its removal from the trees where it belongs. Superstition or not, there's no denying its presence stirs the imagination. Spanish moss doesn't just grow in the South, it haunts it most gently and poetically. Today, Spanish moss is as much a symbol of the South as sweet tea or front porches, and people have grown attached to it. Yet despite its romantic image, it's not always welcome, especially when it grows too thick or starts causing trouble near power lines, rooftops, or city parks. While Spanish moss doesn't harm the trees it hangs on, heavy clusters can sometimes block sunlight from reaching the leaves underneath. In very dense amounts, especially after a rain when it becomes waterlogged and heavy, it can even cause branches to sag or break. For this reason, some property owners or cities cut it out occasionally, but rarely remove it altogether. It's a delicate balance between beauty and practicality. Overharvesting posed a more significant threat in the past. During its peak use in the early 20th century, large quantities of moss were stripped from trees for manufacturing and furniture making. That industry has mostly faded, and the moss has been left to hang freely in most places again, with little interference. Today, some people still collect it for crafts or home decor, but it's usually done on a much smaller, more respectful scale. As for conservation, Spanish moss doesn't appear on any endangered list but is sensitive to environmental changes. It thrives in clean, humid air. It withers when air quality dips or climates shift, becoming too dry or polluted. That makes it something of a natural air quality indicator. Where Spanish moss thrives, you can bet the air is still pretty good. In some parts of the U.S., significantly farther north or west, people try to transplant or grow it indoors. While it can survive in controlled environments, nothing beats the sight of it in its natural habitat, spilling from live oaks in slow, silvery waves under a sky that feels like it hasn't changed in centuries. Spanish moss doesn't bloom brightly or grow in orderly rows. It doesn't call attention to itself with fragrance or color. Instead, it hangs quietly, patiently from tree limbs, swaying with the wind, draping the south in a graceful stillness. And yet, it holds stories. Stories of rivalry between nations, traditions of native ingenuity, the grit of early settlers, the secrets of the swamps, and the imaginations of those who've wandered beneath its shade. It's a plant that doesn't take from the earth, yet quietly gives back, providing shelter, sparking folklore, and weaving into a region's identity. For something so weightless, Spanish moss carries centuries of meaning. Its threads connect people to place, to memory, and each other. Take a second look the next time you see it, whether in a photograph, on a road trip through the low country, or dangling over a bayou. It's not just a decoration hanging from a tree, it's nature's history, gently suspended, waiting to be noticed. Thank you for tuning into the Ancestral Findings podcast. Be sure to visit ancestralfindings.com to grab your free genealogy ebook. Ask for a complimentary genealogy lookup, and sign up for our weekly historical postcard giveaway. A special thanks to our Patreon supporters. Your contributions help to anchor our family tree firmly in the ground, allow our lineage to fly high, and keep our journey through history on the right path. Wishing you a fantastic day and happy searching.